Welcome, everyone. My name is Adam Savitt. I'm Director of Communications at the Center for Security Policy. It's wonderful to be back after a 4-week hiatus. We closed out our Biothreats webinar series just at the beginning of August, but now we're back. We're returning this week with our voter education webinar series. Every week we'll have at least one and sometimes additional webinars right up to the election. Today's program is a book release by acclaimed and prolific author Robert Spencer, entitled Mass Migration in Europe, a Model for the US, and will be moderated by my colleague Kyle Scheidler. Please note that you are in listen-only mode, but you can submit your text questions in the Q&A box in your GoToWebinar panel. The event is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/securefreedom, and on our website at securefreedom.org. And with that, I'll hand it over to our senior analyst for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, Kyle Scheidler.
Thank you, Adam. As Adam remarked, this is the first in our voter education series webinars where we'll be looking at some of the national security issues that are likely to impact the 2020 election. Now, in 2016, issues of immigration and especially mass migration were a major turning point. People were concerned about the southern border and also the issue of the security question of Syrian refugees. Are we going to see a similar question in 2020? The center believes as the U.S. elections approach, the American people need to make clear to both parties that they support policies that reduce mass migration and enable massive population transfers. This includes reinforcing border security, completing the border wall, implementing stricter immigration vetting, and an immigration system that is based on merit and an individual's willingness to assimilate to American norms. Additionally, the U.S. must vocally defend the right of nation states, particularly Western allies, to defend their sovereignty and national borders against those who seek to subsume them. And so this webinar is about what could happen if American voters do not demand these policies. Joining me today is Robert Spencer. He is the director of Jihad Watch and a Shillman Fellow at the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He is the author of many, many books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Islam and the Crusades and the Truth About Muhammad. He has led seminars on jihad and Islam for the FBI, U.S. Central Command, the Army Command and General Staff College, the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and the Justice Department Anti-Terrorism Advisory Council. Very skilled academic and a person great at explaining the issue and the threats that develop out of jihad and jihad ideology. Robert, thank you so much for coming on today to talk about your new book.
Thank you very much for having me, Kyle. It's great to talk to you.
So as I introduced, these were hot topics in 2016, and I'm concerned that people may have forgotten the state of Europe and what was going on with mass migration in Europe, and in fact is still going on now that it's 2020 and they have other concerns. And you do a very good job in the book of reminding us what the threat is and exactly what the situation in Europe is. So I appreciate that very much. But I think it's best to start at the beginning. And one of the important points you raise in the book is that the mass migration from Muslim and Arab states into Europe was something that did not take place against the will of European elites. It was rather a policy that was deliberately encouraged. Talk to us a little bit about what the impetus was for that policy. Where did it come from?
Yeah, you know, Kyle, a lot of people assume that this started in 2015 when Angela Merkel said, we can do this, and opened up the borders of Germany to several million, I think it's well over 2 million now, Muslim migrants just coming in since then yearly. But the beginning of all this was much earlier than that. It actually started in 1973 during the Arab oil crisis, when those of us who are of a certain age will recall that there were long lines for gas and so on, and gas prices skyrocketed, and there was general fear in the Western world that this was going to continue and get worse on an indefinite basis. The European Commission and the European Union they essentially panicked and just reached out to the Arab League to make a deal. They began what is known as the Euro-Arab Dialogue and held a series of conferences called Eurabia, which later became the name of a book by the pioneering historian Batya Or, Eurabia, that traced all this, traced the history of all this. And what's kind of odd about that, just as an aside that I think we'll probably come back to as time goes by during this session, the book Eurabia by Batya Or has been widely derided as a conspiracy theory, but probably almost universally by people who aren't even aware that that is the name of a series of conferences and agreements that the European Union actually made with the Arab League, and that there's no conspiracy about it. It's reality. These documents were signed, and remain in force, and they, in general, prescribe mass immigration of Arab Muslims into Europe, and an agreement by the European Union that there will be no assimilation of those Muslims. This is another paradox of these agreements, that in return for acceptable or even favorable oil prices, the European Union agreed to allow essentially the Muslim Arabs who were coming in to establish enclaves in which they would obey Sharia, Islamic law, rather than the law of the land. And then, of course, these gained publicity as no-go zones, and that became another big controversy. But the fact is that people say these things don't exist, or people often say that it's the fault of the Europeans that the immigrants have not assimilated, when actually there was a conscious decision by both parties involved, the European Union and the Arab League, not to have assimilation, not to make any effort at assimilation among the immigrants, and to allow them to establish exactly these kinds of enclaves.
Right. I think you mentioned in the book, and you do a really good job of tracing this across the continent. For those of you who remember back, these enclaves are sometimes called no-go zones. And this became a bit of a controversy after Fox News aired a presentation about it. And then all of a sudden it was that you couldn't use this term. It was an inappropriate term. These things don't even exist, despite the fact that multiple mass media had used the term before. And had documented that they existed and that this was an issue. So I would like for our audience, either who aren't familiar or who maybe have not understood this issue properly, how do you, Robert Spencer, define what they call a no-go zone? Do they exist, and why is the media unwilling to discuss this phenomenon?
They clearly exist. The French government actually some years ago made a list of 750 of them around the country, and there are no doubt even more now. And they exist in other countries as well. I myself, last time I was in London, which was a while ago for various reasons, in 2009, I took a long walk through East London, which is the majority immigrant area, and I didn't see anything for block after block after block that would have given any, if I hadn't known where I was, wouldn't have given me any indication that I was actually in England. There was nothing of English culture there, except that some of the signs were in English, but you would see the same thing in Karachi. In any case, the no-go zones are essentially Sharia areas where Islamic law takes precedence over the law of the land. But a lot of the controversy over this term stems from it's being defined in different ways by the people who use it. The mainstream media, when they flew into a tizzy about this a few years back, and Anne Hidalgo, the mayor of Paris, threatened to sue Fox News for even mentioning these places, they were assuming and basing their analysis upon the idea that no-go zones were areas where there were no non-Muslim, non-immigrant people present, and they weren't even allowed to come in. No such places exist. And so if that's the definition, then yeah, there are no no-go zones. But the fact is that as a result, direct result of the Euro-Arab leagues, of the Euro-Arab agreements, the Arabia agreements between the Arab League and the European Union, there are Sharia enclaves where in some cases, notably in Malmo, Sweden, but in others as well, the police, the fire personnel, various other essentially government officials, they don't even go in, or they go in very carefully in large groups because they're attacked when they're in there. And in other places they can go in, but nonetheless, the law of the land is Sharia. And this is something that I experienced myself also in Molenbeek and Antwerp, the immigrant area of Antwerp in Belgium. Several years ago, I was walking through and taking pictures, and I was very sternly warned by a halal butcher whose butcher shop was right where I was passing. He said pictures aren't allowed here, and it was very clear. I said, "This is no problem. I'm just an American tourist. You know, I'm your friend," and he wasn't hearing any of it because, as far as he was concerned, Belgian law that allowed a tourist to take pictures on a public street did not apply, but Sharia applied that would forbid non-Muslims from behaving in certain manners when they are in the area that is controlled by Islamic law.
Right. And I think people often get confused because they think that we're talking about a de jure law. But what we're actually talking about is a de facto law, a law of the streets, so to speak. A lot of people think, well, this is something that happens in Europe. It can't happen here in the United States. But I'm reminded of, I think it was an op-ed by Senator Ted Cruz talking about the need to ensure that Muslim communities in the United States received the same level of police protection and police coverage that the rest of the country receives. And this was a statement that was met with outrage by Muslim Brotherhood linked Islamists like the guys at the Council on American Islamic Relations. So this notion that there should be equal protection under American law or the law of the country that it applies in Europe should apply in all areas is a contested one by these guys. They don't agree with that at all.
Yeah, you know, Kyle, you're absolutely right. And it is important to emphasize that we're talking about a de facto situation. It's not as if there is some Islamic republic in the middle of a European city that has a constitution that's based on Sharia. It's just the way that the area works. It's not something that's written down or codified. Ostensibly, they are under the laws of the land. They just ignore them, and the authorities allow them to ignore them. And as far as it goes in terms of it can't happen here, a few years back, it should be remembered that there were some Christian preachers who went to Dearborn, Michigan, and they were preaching during an Arab festival. Now, note that it was an Arab festival. It was not a Muslim festival. And there are quite a few Christian Arabs in the Dearborn area. But nonetheless, the Dearborn police actually came and arrested these Christian preachers for preaching openly in a public area at this Arab festival. They weren't causing a disturbance. They weren't insulting people. They certainly weren't being violent. The only possible legal justification for them having been arrested was that Islamic law forbids Christians to proselytize among Muslims. The Dearborn police, because of pressure from Islamic groups in that area, were essentially enforcing Sharia. Now, this case, of course, was thrown out of court right away, but it was nonetheless a telling and disquieting precedent that indicated that it's really not that hard, once you have the demographics on your side, to get the local authorities to bend to your will and do your bidding, even if it contravenes American law.
One of the points you note in your book is that jihadist groups like the Islamic State are very cognizant of the advantages that mass migration provide to them. It provides them the ability to travel across borders. It provides them, in the case of these enclaves, places to hide and to make preparations for their attacks. You mentioned Molenbeek in Belgium, which is a very hotbed of this sort of activity. In a very real way, they take this mass migration and the acceptance of mass migration to be evidence that they are winning. How does permitting this policy of mass migration, A, bolster jihadist groups, and B, how do they exploit it?
They exploit it in the first place by infiltrating the refugee streams. And this is something that ISIS, the Islamic State, said they would do as far back as February 2015, which is actually before the mass migrant influx began in Europe. It began shortly after, and that is all the more disquieting in light of the fact that they had boasted in February 2015 that they would soon flood Europe with 500,000 refugees. And of course, far more than 500,000 came. The European states have not carried out any kind of adequate screening to make sure that the people who are coming in are peaceful and do not hold to the doctrines of jihad that will lead them ultimately to try to wage war against the people who are in their new home. And it happened right away. As a matter of fact, in November 2015, there were some large-scale jihad massacres in Paris that were carried out by 8 immigrants who just the previous month, in October 2015, had come into Europe as refugees. So this was the Islamic State's boast or warning, however you might want to understand it, in its quintessential form. This is what they came to Europe to do. So clearly, obviously, with this kind of an opportunity afforded them, they clearly believe they're winning because they are. There's not what's being done to stop them. You know, there's so many anecdotal incidents that I can tell you about. One is Shamima Begum, who is a Muslim girl from Britain, a teenager who went from Britain to join the Islamic State. It's not clear what she did while she was living in the Islamic State domains, but there are multiple reports that she was involved in the torture of some of the Yazidi sex slaves and other things of that kind. And she was barred from returning to Britain, but she sued, and a higher court in Britain allowed her to come back. Now, there's no indication that she's not still a jihadi. There's no indication that she's not going to raise her children to be jihadis in Britain. And so the Islamic State, you know, it should be remembered, after they lost their territory in Iraq and Syria, they announced several times that they were changing their strategy to focus upon raising up Muslims for lone wolf attacks, so-called, in Europe and in America. And this refugee situation provides them a perfect opportunity to do that.
Yeah, they had a number of videos featuring young children, some as young as maybe 10 years old, executing people and otherwise engaging in violence. And this was their argument, that we are going to essentially infiltrate your society and then train up children to attempt to reestablish our caliphate. It's very disconcerting. Among the national security threats caused by mass migration are, of course, as we mentioned, the jihad terrorist threat. But the other threat comes from nation-state actors that seek to use mass migration as a weapon or a form of extortion to get what they want on the international stage. You mention in the book particularly one country that is engaged in this practice. I was hoping you would talk a little bit about that country.
Yeah, obviously the Republic of Turkey has been in the news lately because of the appropriation of the historical, cultural landmarks, the churches, Hagia Sophia and the whole Church of the Holy Savior in Kora. the appropriation of them as mosques, when they have been serving as museums since 1935 for Hagia Sophia and 1945 for Kora. This is all just part of the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan's overall plan, essentially to restore the caliphate, to destroy the Turkish secular republic, to install himself apparently as caliph, to reimpose Islamic law upon Turkey. But the Ottoman Empire, the last caliphate, was much larger than the confines of the Republic of Turkey. And Erdogan has announced explicitly in 2018 that that Turkey has never given up its claim to the lands that were part of Ottoman territory. Now, that actually is not true. One of the last acts of the Ottoman Empire was to cede the territory that was part of the empire but is not part of Turkey to the League of Nations, and then various states were formed from it. But taking him at his word, I think analysts would be naive not to take him seriously. What he was essentially saying was that he's laying a claim to Greece, Eastern Europe, Egypt, North Africa, the Holy Land, including Israel, Jordan, Syria, all of that. He's saying that Turkey is going to reclaim it. Now, obviously, he's not. Obviously, he's not going to be able to do that. But will he start wars? Will he end up getting a lot of people killed in trying to do that? I think that's very likely. But here's now the way this ties into the mass migration. He is trying in many ways to weaken Europe while exploiting Turkey's place in NATO and its ongoing attempts to join the European Union. He's boasted about how there will soon be another war between the Sons of the Crescent and the Sons of the Cross, and this time the Sons of the Crescent will conquer Europe. It's clear that he is weaponizing the mass migration phenomenon as part of that war and using it to soften up Europe for his conquest or his attempted conquest. First, Eastern Europe that the Ottomans actually did hold for several centuries, and then no doubt Western Europe following that as well. So he has very clearly stated several times to the European Union that if they don't do his bidding, and one of the main things he's demanding lately is visa-free travel for Turks all around Europe. So, you know, if you're in the European Union, you can go from one country to the other without stopping at the border, without having a visa. And he wants that for Turkish citizens as well, which essentially would open up Europe to an unknowable number of jihad terrorists who would exploit that to come into the continent. He knows that. Who knows? Maybe even the Europeans know that, although that's not clear, unfortunately, because they're in such denial about the nature and magnitude of this threat. And the Germans actually, it's kind of paradoxical. In return for his not sending them more migrants, they have said that they are going to grant him this visa-free travel within Europe. And Germany, of course, has such influence within the European Union that that could be the end of the ballgame right there. But the overall strategy here is to use the migrants to weaken Europe, to make it ripe for conquest, to flood it full of people among whom many will be essentially Erdogan's foot soldiers. And this is underscored. This is not another conspiracy theory either, because he's gone to Germany several times and spoken to Turkish migrants there, telling them, look, you are Turks, you are not Germans, you are not to assimilate, you have to remember your first allegiance is to Turkey. And, you know, that only begs the question of, is there another shoe that's going to drop, and when is it going to drop? When is he going to call upon them to express that loyalty in Germany and destabilize German society?
And there were stories out of Europe, even of Turkish intelligence fomenting connections with Turkish outlaw motorcycle clubs and helping arm them. So this is not an idle threat by Erdogan. Once he gets his people, as you said, activated in these areas, he does then use that to turn the screws. See similar things with pro AKP, that's the Erdogan's Islamist party, the AKP, pro-AKP political parties being set up in places like Bulgaria, where they also exploit this. So I think that's for people who aren't familiar with Erdogan and what he is doing in utilizing mass migration, I think the book is going to be an eye-opener, Robert. So I'm really glad that you included that element of it. Talking about Eastern Europe actually brings us a little bit to the question of the rise of resistance to mass migration policies. You know, in Europe, we have now seen the rise of several populist voices that have opposed mass migration. They've encouraged assimilationist policies and called for strengthening borders. And you talk in the book about a number of these individuals, and I was hoping you could talk to me and our audience about some of them. Who is leading the resistance to this mass migration policy that's been implemented by the European elite?
One of the primary foes of this, what's essentially the suicide of Europe, is the leader of Hungary, Viktor Orban, who is also working with the Czech Republic, with Slovakia, and with Poland. And I believe there's some others, but they're escaping me at the moment. But in any case, these Central European states and Eastern European states are all united in opposing this mass migration project. And the European Union has brought immense pressure upon them. And I think ultimately this is going to be an issue if Orban sticks to his guns. This is going to be the issue that destroys the European Union, because there's no way that it can stand. As of course Lincoln said, a house divided, and the Bible says a house divided against itself cannot stand. This is what we see with Europe nowadays, that Orban wants no mass migration, wants to maintain Hungary's cultural integrity as a Christian state and as a European state, and makes no apologies about that. It's very rare because, of course, that kind of position gets you called a racist and a bigot nowadays in Europe and worldwide. It's only Europeans who are not allowed to defend their own culture and their own heritage. But Orban makes no bones about it. The Polish Prime Minister, Duka, same thing. These men are standing against the EU, and the EU makes all sorts of threats against them, financial penalties and other kinds of penalties, and threatens even to has threatened even to send troops to force Hungary to take its quota, so-called, of migrants. But so far, Orban is standing firm, and he is one of the only leaders in Europe who is passionately, forcefully, eloquently, articulately explaining why this mass migration project is not just about caring for refugees, but there are immense implications to it for Europe's future.
What has been the reaction from European elites to this populist resistance? How have they responded? And obviously not just to national leaders like Orban, but to their own citizens and their own political parties that have grown up in their countries talking about these sorts of issues. How have they responded?
Well, you know, Kyle, it's really kind of predictable based on how the Center for Security Policy and other organizations like it are treated in the American media. The same thing has happened to the Alliance for Deutschland, the Alliance for Germany, which is an anti-immigration party, not actually an anti-immigration party, it's an anti-mass migration party, the party that is opposed to Merkel's policies of indiscriminate open border immigration. It's not opposed to all immigration in principle, but that party, the Sweden Democrats, who are obviously in Sweden, the what is the Danish People's Party, and what's the name of Geert Wilders' party in the Netherlands?
The Freedom Party?
Yeah, that is the Freedom Party. All of them are characterized routinely, smeared and defamed most unfairly in the media in Europe and in the United States as well as racist, xenophobic, neo-Nazi even, and trying to drag Europe back to the dark ages of race hatred and Hitler, eugenic supremacism. This is all absolute fabrication and nonsense. But the European political and media elites have worked hard and have been quite successful in stigmatizing any opposition under any grounds to mass migration as being motivated by racism and hatred, and discounted any national security considerations, any considerations about the integrity of the culture, the cohesiveness of the society, the lack of wisdom of establishing these enclaves that hold to a completely different law and a completely different culture. All of that is brushed aside as racism. And that's really their only answer. They just demonize the people who are standing up and try to get people of goodwill to turn away as a result of that.
And try to shut them up. And I think one of the most important victims of the European experience with mass migration has been free speech, and really two different types of repression, and one coming from these governments that have utilized criminal code, blasphemy laws, and other legal techniques to target free speech. And then, of course, you also have a threat from self-appointed enforcers, both including jihadists, but also hard left activist groups like Antifa. And it occurred to me preparing for this webinar that, Robert, you have been a victim of all three of these enforcers of against free speech. And so I wanted to get your take. What is the gravest threat to free speech?
Well, yeah, the biggest thing, thank you for mentioning this, because this is a huge problem in Europe today and growing problem in the United States, that not only are the foes of these policies derided, defamed, smeared as racists and bigots and so on, but also there are active efforts to silence them in France and in other areas of Europe with criminal penalties. And Brigitte Bardot, the famous actress, has several times been heavily fined for criticizing Sharia mistreatment of animals. She's an animal rights activist. In Austria, the human rights activist Elizabeth Sabadich-Wolf was giving a private talk and was asked by a person who came up to her during a break. So this was as non-public as you can get, about whether Muhammad would be considered a pedophile for being 54 when he consummated his marriage with his 9-year-old bride. And she answered in the affirmative and was prosecuted and fined and threatened with imprisonment under Austrian law. And then she appealed to the European Court of Human Rights and lost there, where the ruling was that the freedom of speech has to give way to the importance of not offending Muslims, whether what you're saying is true or not. In my case, of course, I was banned from entering Great Britain in 2013. They said that it was for 3 to 5 years, but it seems like it's essentially for life. And this was because, according to the letter from the UK Home Office that was sent to me, it was because I had said on a video that Islam has doctrines of warfare against unbelievers and wants to subjugate the unbelievers under the rule of Islamic law. Now, this is a demonstrably true statement. It's readily establishable from the Islamic texts. Lots of Muslim scholars will tell you that that is indeed the case, but they didn't want these unpleasant truths enunciated in Britain. And so I have been barred from the country. And actually, there are many other people now who have been barred from Britain as well. That seems to be a favored tactic that they have to appease their increasingly restive Muslim community, their growing Muslim community, and to try to give the impression that they are fighting not against just the jihadis, which of course they're not really doing in any effective way, but also against the threat of the far right, so-called, which really just means anybody they don't like and want people not to like. Also in Germany a few years back, I was speaking at an outdoor rally of some of these groups that were fighting against the mass migration phenomenon, and that's where I first encountered Antifa. Actually, I was standing. There were so many police. There were hundreds of police all around, and I was standing with a group of the people who had invited me, and there was a young man among them who I didn't know, and I figured he must be one of the other organizers who I haven't yet met. So I stuck out my hand and shook his hand and said it was thanks for having me here and so on. And he said, if it weren't for all these police around right now, you would already be dead. And he turned out to be Antifa. He had just come up to our group and people hadn't realized who he was. When the event started, we were up on a stage outdoors and Antifa started throwing rocks and bottles and all kinds of things at us on the stage. And the police stood between them and us, but didn't keep them far enough away not to be able to throw all these things onto the stage. Now, this was 10 years ago. It was a harbinger of things to come, obviously, that Antifa is trying violently to shut up those that it hates and those who stand in the way of its globalist internationalist vision, which coalesces very well with the globalist internationalist jihad vision of imposing Sharia everywhere. They are both the far left and Sharia supremacists want to impose totalitarian systems that deny the freedom of speech and the equality of rights of all people before the law. So they get along very well with each other. And so this was an early example of the police aiding a thuggishness and violence instead of stepping in to do something effective about it.
Well, that almost preempts my next question, but I want to ask it anyway. You, Robert, were also under threat here in the United States when your organization held a cartoon contest to counter threats against free speech in Garland, Texas. And two jihadists of the Islamic State actually traveled all the way from Arizona to kill you and your co-organizers. And I remember at the time, the reaction from the mainstream media and elements of the elite was, I think, also, and you used the word harbinger, and I think that's right, a harbinger of what was to come, because the overall message was, you know, he shouldn't have been there, he shouldn't have said that, and they deserve what they get. There was a headline, I think it was maybe in the Washington Post, that said, event organizer has yet to apologize for event that, you know, almost got them killed. And I think we see echoes of, not even echoes of this, but overwhelming elements of this in today's civil unrest, where we see time and time again the claim that the conservative, whether it's on a college campus or at an event in some typically left-leaning city like Portland, shouldn't have been there. They didn't have a right to be there and to say the things that they wanted to say. Is there an element of, as you said, the elite encouraging this violence?
Oh, very much so, yeah. You know, Kyle, I spoke about 3 years ago at Stanford University, and there was a huge campaign beforehand, a lot of nonsense, you know, people saying, oh, they felt threatened because I was coming. And I thought, what do you think I'm going to do, beat you up?
If anyone has ever seen Robert at his full height, that is not very likely.
So, but there was an intense smear campaign. And then when I got there, the auditorium was packed. It was absolutely full. But about 5 minutes into the event, almost everyone in the room, except for the organizers of the event, stood up and walked out. Now, what's interesting about that is that it was not a spontaneous protest. It was orchestrated by Stanford administrators who had pre-planned it with student leftist organizers to make sure that they got all the seats and that people who actually wanted to come and hear what I was going to say weren't able to get in. And then those same administrators would not let in those people, even though only about 5 or 10 minutes had passed. They wouldn't let in anybody who actually wanted to hear what was going on. And so this was supposedly a protest that was orchestrated by the students, but the administration involvement was very clear. And it's interesting to note that, as you mentioned about the event in Texas, about the Muhammad cartoon contest, it's interesting to note that there's been a sharp degeneration of the interest in defending the freedom of speech in the United States. If you think back to 1989, when Salman Rushdie got the death fatwa from the Ayatollah Khomeini for supposedly insulting Islam in his book, The Satanic Verses, everyone rallied to his defense and said what a great hero he was, and we have to defend the freedom of speech, and it's very important. Our event in Texas was 26 years later, a quarter century later. You're absolutely right. Not only were we told, you don't poke the bear, you don't provoke them, which, if you think about it, it sounds commonsensical, but it's really saying surrender to violent intimidation. But you're absolutely right. The main organizer of the event, Pamela Geller, was excoriated everywhere, and even after she got a death fatwa herself from ISIS, and there was an actual attempt on her life by people who were planning to travel from Boston to New York and behead her, it was still all her fault and all our fault that we just have internalized in the years since Rushdie the idea that you just don't do that. You don't offend Muslims in that way because they'll get violent. Excuse me, which only means that you're going to get more violence because you're encouraging it and showing that it works.
And now, I mean, we see, we used to talk about this in the context of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation and the so-called test of consequences, where the argument was that for cases of incitement to violence, the inciter was the person who spoke, even if the violence they incited was against themselves. And this was what it was at play in your situation in Garland, where regardless of the fact that you had a right to say the thing that you said, it provoked someone to violence, and that therefore is your fault. And I think it is horrifying to me that we are seeing a similar dynamic at work today. If you look at some of the language coming out of this campaign, of the election campaign, where they're claiming that violence perpetrated against, for example, Trump supporters is the fault of President Trump himself. So it is not just people like Robert Spencer, but even the President of the United States can be forced to into this twisted logic. And I think that's very concerning.
Yeah, excuse me, Kyle. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off there, but it's interesting to note that the more that they do this twisted logic, the more that they twist themselves into pretzels, the easier it gets. It's just like any exercise, the more you do it, the easier it gets. The more you practice your guitar, the easier it is to play. And so it's the same thing with this. We are being trained in the United States. We are being conditioned by constant repetition of this nonsense to think that the victim of the violence is the perpetrator of the violence if he has done something that offends the liberal norms, the norms of the leftist political class and their jihadi allies.
Sure. I want to turn to our audience and see, or throw it open to them and see if they have any questions they'd like me to ask you while we have you here. So what will happen is each, here we have Adam. Adam will walk us through it.
Yeah, well, we've had text questions submitted, so I'll just go ahead and hopefully get to as many of them as I can.
Okay, great.
So how influential is Muhammad's hijrah in 622 and his role as perfect model for the migration of Muslims today?
Oh, that's very important, and that's very little remarked upon. But chapter 4, verse 100 of the Quran promises a reward from Allah for those who emigrate in the way of Allah and die in the new land. Now, this is a very important idea because they're not just emigrating, they're not just going to get another job, to have a better life, to live in an area where there's not war. They are going, the verse stipulates that they have to be going in the cause of Allah. They are emigrating in the way of Allah. And that means that they are going to bring Islamic law to the new land, to Islamize the new land. Now, that's exactly the phenomenon that we're seeing, as I noted before, with the Sharia enclaves all over Europe. And there have been numerous interviews of migrants who say, well, I'm coming here to spread Islam. And that means that, they are trying to lay hold of this reward from Allah. And that is very important in an Islamic context, because you see, there is the idea in Islam that if you in your judgment, and this is chapter 21, verse 47 of the Quran, when you were judged by Allah, there'll be these great scales, and your good deeds will be on one scale, your bad deeds will be on the other. If your bad deeds outweigh your good deeds, you go directly to hell. But if your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds, you enter paradise. Now, the problem with that is that it can drive you crazy, because you don't know how many good deeds or how many bad deeds you've committed, and you don't know how much each one weighs. And so if you really take this seriously, it can start to weigh on your mind to the extent that you start to think, well, all I have to do to get a promised, a guaranteed reward from Allah is emigrate. And that is something that is completely overlooked by mainstream analysts today, because they completely discount the role of Islam in all matters related to jihad, related to terrorism, related to Sharia. It just doesn't exist for them. But it's a powerful inducement for a pious, knowledgeable, and believing Muslim to think that emigrating is something that he ought to do and is going to be beneficial for him, even if he has a hard time in the new land.
Tommy Robinson reports from parts of the UK where boatloads of migrants are landing daily. Where is the UK or BBC to report on this? Are they perhaps fulfilling the agreements Robert has told us about?
Yeah, it's extraordinary, really. The UK is in terrible shape. Labour was completely on board with the mass migration initiative, and they lost big in the last election. One of the primary reasons that they lost big was that they were for these mass migrations. But the Conservative Party has turned around and become Labour and is not doing a single thing. There are migrant boats landing every day. There are tens of thousands of migrants who are coming all the time into Britain across the Channel, sometimes even escorted by the French Navy, because the French don't want them in France. And Boris Johnson has done nothing. They have sometimes been put up in luxury hotels in the southern part of Britain, and it doesn't look as if there's any end to this in sight. It seems as if it's the complete triumph of this fear of racism and bigotry that I touched on before, that British authorities are so paralyzed by that they don't dare do the slightest thing. Even when they were elected to do something about this problem, they don't dare.
This is an interesting one, and I wonder if there are actual numbers on it. How great is the problem of ideology creep, i.e. conversion to Islam, from the no-go areas into non-Muslim areas?
I don't think there are any statistics on that. I've never seen any anyway. This is not the sort of thing that people who take surveys are interested in generally. But there's no doubt that there is a steady stream of converts to Islam in all these countries that are being inundated by mass migration. And it's not just converts to Islam. If you go to my website, jihadwatch.org, there is a drop-down box on the right sidebar, categories. And there is a category, converts to Islam. And in it, you will find story after story after story, going back years, of converts to Islam who end up becoming jihad terrorists. And so the point is, they are not just people who convert to Islam, but they are being actively recruited by jihad groups, because converts can go without suspicion to places where at least the jihadis think that I think erroneously, they think that an Arab or some other person from a majority Muslim country will be suspected. A white, red-haired fellow will not be. And so there's active recruitment from jihad groups of converts to Islam. And it's extraordinary that there is not a single government or law enforcement agency in the entire world that has made any attempt whatsoever to study the recurring phenomenon of converts to Islam turning to jihad, or to do the first thing to try to stop it. And this is just one small example of the massive failure of our law enforcement and intelligence apparatus in dealing with this threat.
What is your best elevator speech to tell a person about why Islam can't exist with our constitutional principles?
Islam denies the freedom of speech, denies the equality of rights of women with men. It is deeply and inherently anti-Semitic. And these are the texts. This is not the people. Some of the people may be absolutely lovely. The fact is, though, that the teachings provide justification for this behavior that is called extremist. And consequently, Western states and all non-Muslim countries ultimately are going to have to reckon with whether they are going to go the Sharia route or whether they are going to continue as free societies. But there is no way that people who believe in Sharia will ever be satisfied living under a constitution that is not based on Sharia.
I think one of the challenges there too is that secular systems of government and the sort of the elites that make them up don't know how to take belief seriously. They don't know how to take religious belief seriously. And so they don't know what to do with these sorts of things. They don't understand why someone would reject all of the material benefits of a new society in exchange for a belief system. And so that they end up being utterly baffled as to how to address these things.
That's extremely important, Kyle. Thank you, because there's a moral vacuum. There's a spiritual vacuum in the West today. As the West has discarded Christianity, something is going to fill that gap. And people look around for some meaning in their lives, for some purpose in their lives, for something that's just beyond material gratification. And there are numerous Islamic organizations in Europe and in the United States that are working energetically to be what they embrace, to try to fill that spiritual void. But the secular elites can't understand that and have no idea how to deal with it, if they even care to deal with it, because they are among those who have discarded Europe's spiritual foundations. And so they simply don't understand the importance of this.
And I think their cultural foundations too. I mean, we're seeing this now with the iconoclasm here in the United States, of the need to rename buildings and tear down statues, where everything that is American and culturally American is somehow repudiated by the very people who grew up with it.
Yeah.
In favor of foreign multicultural and foreign cultures that they don't even really understand.
Oh yeah, and they're trying to make us hate our own culture and heritage, be ashamed of being American, and then of course a people that is ashamed of itself, ashamed of its own history and heritage, is a people that's ripe for conquest. And that's the idea here. These are Marxist internationalists, and they want to destroy the United States. So the people don't realize that all these wars on statues, and the latest that came out of Washington, D.C., that they want to take down the Washington Monument now, and the Jefferson Memorial, these things are all part of a war on the United States that will ultimately result in its destruction.
On that cheery note.
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, do you have any more questions for us?
Yeah, there's several. We have a few minutes, yeah? So,
yeah, I think I'd give us one more if you have a good one.
Oh, okay. Well, a general one, but this is the key question here. Can the damage done to European security by mass migration be reversed? Is Europe doomed?
I would never say Europe is doomed. It's not even doomed if it falls, because history is very long and time just keeps going on. It's not going to be the end of the world if France becomes an Islamic state. Remember that Spain was occupied by Muslims and was an Islamic state, an Islamic entity, for 700 years. And then the non-Muslims in Spain drove out the invaders. Now, I don't think Europe, obviously, to be completely honest and in line with what we were just saying, Europe, as it is currently constituted, does not have the spiritual energy to do that. But that doesn't mean it won't ever recover it. or find it somewhere. And as the great philosopher Yogi Berra said, it ain't over till it's over. And the fact is, yes, the situation is very dire, but history is full of surprises. And I never give up hope, because as long as I'm free and alive, then there's still a chance. And so Europe still very much has a chance.
Well, I think on that happy note, we will close out. Robert, thank you so much for doing this and for writing the book. I will encourage everyone to take a look at our website, securefreedom.org, where they'll find a link to Amazon in order to order the book. It is absolutely worth having, as all Spencer books are, worth picking up. Robert, thank you so much. We hope we'll have an opportunity to have you back in the near future. I'm sure we will. Please do check out his work at jihadwatch.org. Robert Spencer, thank you.
Thank you. Pleasure.